Hello again, this is Liam O'Mara. You're on Office Hours with the Mad Professor. We're continuing our Conversations series and chatting with some of the congressional candidates, contenders in this 2022 election cycle. And today we're chatting with Shahid Buttar, who's running up in California's 11th against Nancy Pelosi. So how's it going, Shahid?
Great to be with you, Liam. Thanks so much for having me.
It's my pleasure. I've been a fan for a long time. You know, I enjoyed meeting you way back when. Gosh, what was it? 2019, something like that. Seems like ages ago now.
It was ages ago. I think, yeah, just a couple of years how much has changed in the world. So.
Yeah. I mean, it's a really interesting time to be alive. You know, I have
in the manner of the Chinese curse, that kind of interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. May you live in interesting times. Yeah. So, I always have fun with that too. I mean, it's people who get into that weird, like, golden agey kind of stuff, the weird nostalgia. And I'm like, I'm a historian. I'm like, things were pretty awful in the past too. And, there are always, kind of like new challenges that crop up. But it's interesting how we have to kind of keep our eye on the ball, whatever, and watch for those things. So what we're going to do, I want to start off a little bit of brief introduction, see if you can give your elevator pitch, so to speak, and let people know, who you are and why you're in this race.
Appreciate that. I'm running ultimately to challenge corruption in Washington. And it's a corruption that knows many dimensions and many shapes, and unfortunately, many political parties. Mm-hmm. There's an industrial complex surrounding everything from fossil fuels to pharmaceuticals to the military and weapons. Those dimensions of corruption are reinforced by congressional insider trading and the divided loyalties that pit members of Congress and their private stock portfolios against the public interest and the needs of a public that is confounded by these compounding crises that Washington has done everything possible under the leaderships of both Democrats and Republicans to unfortunately reinforce and exacerbate instead of solve it. And from the crisis in public health that the pandemic presents to the climate crisis to the crises in human rights that we see unfolding around the world, from one issue to the next, we've seen Democrats, corporate Democrats, led particularly by Nancy Pelosi, align themselves with Wall Street and the Pentagon instead of the visionary values that have long united San Francisco. And I'm running to represent my city and to give my city a voice in Washington, a voice I dare say that Washington desperately needs.
Absolutely. And really, I think we all know that San Francisco does deserve better than either a very, very long-term incumbent. How long has she been in there now?
This will be her 35th year.
Yeah. It's just, more than a lot of voters have been alive, much less voting. And not only do we deserve some kind of regular change in the representation so people don't get caught up in that machine, caught up in what Trump called the swamp that sort of sucks everything in, but we really do deserve people that respect and represent the voices of the communities. And we all know that San Francisco is a pretty progressive place. And Pelosi's voting record is, in many ways, anything but. Am I fair in...
Yeah, absolutely. She is decidedly conservative. And what you're describing at the moment is a subject of widespread misinformation. Many people in San Francisco believe the media constructed narrative that Nancy Pelosi is a lion of the supposed liberal left, when nothing could be further from the truth. This is someone who has grown fantastically wealthy over the generation that she's been in public office. And she's become fantastically wealthy, putting her stock portfolio before the needs and of her constituents. Now, that shows up in every conceivable policy area. There's never been a military spending increase proposed that Nancy Pelosi did not support. There's never been a government surveillance program that Nancy Pelosi did not support. The concentration camps at our country's borders, she funded them. The DHS goon squads that Trump deployed from Kenosha to Portland to suppress peaceful dissent against paramilitary troops assassinating our neighbors. They were funded by none other than Nancy Pelosi. She expanded Trump's corporate trade authority on the very day that she impeached him. The layers of obfuscation and the vast disparity between the rhetoric on the one hand, which not just Pelosi, but many corporate Democrats will talk a big game about their supposedly progressive principles. And ultimately, the reason I'm running for office is that I pay too much attention, and I have for too long, to be fooled by the cult of personality that has emerged around Pelosi. And I recognize that from denying a floor vote on Medicare for all to denying congressional committees and committee assignments to critical proponents of the Green New Deal, Pelosi has, from one issue to the next, been a gatekeeper impeding every major progressive priority pending before Congress for the last generation. And I'm grateful that in the last couple of years, she's at least nodded in different places to the need to show up better. And I'm very grateful. I mean, I'm grateful particularly to our supporters for putting us in a position to hold her accountable, because on issues from civil rights to worker rights, I've seen Pelosi shift in response to our campaign, adopting parts of our platform now on 7 different issues, ranging from congressional insider trading, which she hasn't gone all the way where we want her to,
right,
to worker rights and labor rights. And having had the opportunity to hold accountable a person as powerful as the Speaker of the House and induce her to change her positions, I'm grateful for that influence, and I'm grateful for the responsiveness that she has had to the delegitimation of her seat as someone who, and I want to make this clear, it's not just the case that for 35 years she's been impeding progressive policies while prioritizing her wealth. She's also been ducking debates the entire time, never, not once.
Right.
Since going to Congress in 1987 has Nancy Pelosi debated an opponent, which is to say she coasts by on media attention from journalists who don't ask hard questions or ask follow-up questions or connect one news cycle to the next. And the opportunity, the need, frankly, to educate San Francisco about how we have been represented for the last 35 years is a critical strategic goal of our campaign, and one that we're pursuing in a lot of different ways.
Absolutely. And I've been happy to see that. I think I'm glad you bring it up, because it's one thing that I think a lot of people miss about progressive challengers, the insurgent campaigns, the primary challenges from the left is, well, why would you do this? Blah, blah, blah. It only helps Republicans, this and that. Well, A, we deserve better. But B, even if you don't pull something off, the fact that you're making a credible campaign against somebody often forces changes. And in the end, we benefit from that. We all benefit from that. So yeah, I watched a lot of people really lose hope when a lot of people didn't win, their favorite candidates go down, when Bernie went down twice, and a lot of people were like, oh, I'll never vote Democrat again. No, you're kind of missing the point. We have to play the long game here. We have to keep trying. We will win more and more races. But every one that we lose, if we mounted a significant campaign, we will have pushed something and we will have changed the narratives.
Absolutely. What I hear you describing is the layer of politics that is beneath the waterline that many people don't observe.
Right.
And ultimately, what it boils down to is the distinction between politics on the one hand and policy on the other. Politics is the process that constructs who gets to make policy.
Right.
And policy is the outcome of these deliberative processes in legislatures. I run as a policy advocate. I have, frankly, no interest in politics at all.
Right.
It's like not even that interesting to me. I have a very deep concern about principles and history and constitutional rights and values and checks and balances and transparency and all of those things. But at the end of the day, that's a process commitment. And this gets back to the corruption that we are running to confront and end and overcome. And I do see a tremendous resonance across the ideological spectrum for people who are concerned about corruption. Because while I am a dyed-in-the-wool leftist, you need not be even progressive to be concerned about corporate interests driving Congress off a climate cliff and into an authoritarian abyss. Plenty of people in the center, even conservatives, share concerns about the corporate co-optation of Congress. And at the end of the day, this is a race, like many of the ones around our country, that pit we, the people of the United States, against our institutions. And while many people, to your original point, focus on the obvious metric, did you win an election or not? The more important thing at the end of the day is, what are the policy outcomes coming out of the legislatures? And frankly, as a challenger, if I'm able to drag Pelosi to adopt new policies, and we did that 6 different times in 2020, those are victories bigger than a seat in Congress.
Absolutely.
And I've already won more than I set out for. And so, I often, and I face critics from across the political spectrum, many people who claim to be socialists who, deride what we're doing because we're running up a cliff, and it's because they don't understand how politics influence policy. And the passage of the Protecting Right to Organize Act or the Justice and Policing Act through the House in 2020, neither of which have passed the Senate yet, but they'd never passed the House before. And the first year they passed the House, was the first year that Pelosi faced another Democrat in the general election.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm eager, being in the same position again to win the general primary coming up in 3 months. I'm quite eager to see what other policies we can hold her accountable on the way to liberating her seat and ending the political dynasty that has co-opted the city's voice in Washington for too long.
Absolutely. And I love the contrast between the policies and the politics, because the people who function as career politicians who just come back in again and again and again, and they love their television appearances and the talking points and whatnot, they love the politics. They love winning.
Right.
When I tried to get into this, I came at it as a policy wonk, which is difficult running in an election, especially running in where I was in a red seat too, to try and win those arguments, to try and get people to consider other alternatives, to consider other policies, when everyone is so used to the way the media is basically force feeding particular messages to us, and they often do divide people against their own interests and against their own principles. Think about corruption. 90% of Americans are on board with this and say that Washington is a cesspool. Republicans across the board can't stand either DC or corporate corruption, and are increasingly critical of it, yet they continue to support politicians who are enabling that. Liberals do the same thing. And but they often labor under a similar delusion that they're not. I love that you brought up too at the beginning here, this, well, I like the way you put it. I've been watching this stuff too deeply for too long. I came at this okay, Pelosi got in the 86 run, right? The period, the 80s is when we started to see a significant shift toward the DLC's narrative and the pro-corporate, pro-business faction there. The first campaign I pushed hard in and voted in was in the primary for 92 to try and stop Bill Clinton because he could, in public, mouth some of the right populist platitudes, but we knew who was funding him. And ultimately that was the same thing that, it was problematic about Obama, because Obama was deeply funded by Wall Street from the start, but again, mouthing the right kind of populist rhetoric. And we pay attention to the politics of it, the sound bites, what they say, and people don't watch what they do and where the money is coming from.
And this is ultimately critical when we think about institutional capacity and Congress performing its constitutional function. The role of Congress, in addition to making policy and appropriating federal funds, is to check and balance, to oversee the rest of the government, particularly the executive branch. And that's a dimension of the role for Congress that is completely lost on everyone from members of Congress to journalists to the body politic. And I look at this particularly through the lens of having been an issue advocate, fighting the surveillance state, watching one after another government whistleblower come forward with facts proving that officials were lying under oath time after time, and then time after time ending up those whistleblowers under the bus or in military custody.
Right.
Congress choosing to bury its head in the sand instead of embrace truth tellers and find facts. And this is a dimension of corruption that extends beyond any particular issue. And it's also extends beyond any political party. This I describe as something of a constitutional crisis. And those aren't even my words. That's Senator Dianne Feinstein speaking on the floor of the U.S. Senate in 2014 under the Obama administration about the CIA's attack on the Senate. The CIA waged a cyber espionage campaign to steal documents from the Senate that the Senate had collected, proving the agency's criminal complicity in international human rights violations through its enhanced interrogation program. And in that context, the constitutional crisis that she decried, and just to be clear, Dianne Feinstein is no raging leftist. Right?
Oh, no.
As conservative a Democrat as they come. She's a rubber stamp for every conceivable kind of government abuse. She was the chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee for years and had nothing to say about the mass surveillance that was institutionalized under her watch. But this, the efforts by the CIA to hide its criminal culpability in torture, this drove her to decry a constitutional crisis. Now, just to play out the tape, what was the end result of this? The report that she wanted to release to the public remains secret to this day. The CIA official who presided over the destruction of the evidence, the videotapes documenting torture, that person, Gina Haspel, now leads the agency as the CIA director. Obama said, we tortured some folks. That's the end of it. And now in 2022, as a foreign power is invading another country,
right,
and we are called on by some people to defend human rights that we have no legitimacy to claim to have ever defended in practice.
Right.
I mean, there are a few countries in the world that have done more to undermine international human rights than the United States. Yeah. And I'm just to offer people data points who might not have had an opportunity to remember this history, we're the only country in the history of humankind to deploy weapons of mass destruction against civilian populations. We jail and imprison more people as a percent of our own population than any country in the world. We tortured some folks. We waged serial wars for imperial corporate profit and plunder. And we supposedly presume upon ourselves the legitimacy to guard human rights or democracy anywhere in the world. I mean, it's farcical to anybody with the independence to remember the facts. And so much of our problem, of course, in this day and age is that facts are so few and far between in the public discussion. And most of what passes for news media is just, one dimension of propaganda or another. And the ability of the body politic to make intelligent decisions based on accurate understandings of fact is one of the most crucially contested, frankly, basic dimensions of democracy that we need to fight for in this day and age. But the fight against disinformation, whether it's disinformation weaponized by a right-wing, brown shirt network, or whether it's the disinformation peddled by Wall Street that is dominating cable news and network news as we speak. In both of these contexts, it's crucial to see through, to have the independence to see through these narratives, to examine real facts and come to our own conclusions about better opportunities to serve our communities and our country.
Absolutely. And it's one of the reasons that we do have a responsibility to, well, as Jello Biafra said, become the media and sort of push back against a lot of this stuff, because we've allowed massive... old punk.
I met him in an elevator once.
Cool, yeah. We were just talking about the 80s and the big shift there. It was back in the 80s that we had Herman and Chomsky putting out their propaganda model of the media. We had Ben Bagdikian beginning to sort of track the consolidation of media. We're down to like 5 corporations controlling, 85% of what we all see. It's insane the degree to which we are stuck with this. It's not really just state secrets and state surveillance we have to deal with. There's corporate surveillance, and then there's a completely complicit media that's tied into so many other corporate interests that it has no real incentive to report on things. Just think about why someone like Pelosi gets away with calling herself a progressive, completely destroying any utility in the word, and not really showing people that there are real alternatives. I mean, to paint someone like Pelosi, or for that matter, Biden, as a raging lefty when they are far rightist on the economy, like way into Milton Friedman sort of territory there. And most people have no idea.
Pelosi openly backs Republican policies. Student debt relief is a perfect example. 12 years ago, I was part of a nationwide movement that occupied civic squares across the United States. One of the central demands of the Occupy movement was to cancel student debt. Biden promised to, doesn't even need congressional support to do it. It's solely within his executive authority under existing federal statutes. And one of the figures who both says it's a bad idea to cancel student debt and who says that Biden lacks the authority to do it is none other than the Democratic Speaker of the House.
Right.
And when we have Democratic presidents who have to fight powerful Democratic legislators to enact and pursue popular progressive reforms, there might be a problem here at the end of the day. When you were talking about media and the institutional disinterest in so many of these issues, I want to maybe add a little sauce to that recipe and suggest that it also is a crisis in the media's capacity. And I want to offer the example here of the prosecution of Julian Assange, which is not even the subject of widespread media discussion in the United States, even though this is the first ever prosecution of a publisher for revealing to the public military crimes and cover-ups. The rights of the press have never been more sharply implicated. The very capacity of the press to perform its constitutional function, the reason we have a First Amendment that includes the right of the press, is because the press is supposed to be an independent agent of transparency. But when the press is criminalized for publishing crimes and cover-ups, which is to say not in any way threatening national security, but simply for threatening the security of some people's careers and jobs, when that becomes prosecutable, as it has been And remember, the prosecution of Assange has been a bipartisan commitment. Republicans and Democrats alike have overseen this open assault, not just on the freedom of the press, not even just on the capacity of the press to perform its constitutional function, but ultimately on the right of the public to know what is being done in our names with our resources. It is an assault on democracy at root.
All right.
And
How many?
yet, the press is nowhere to be found. Sorry, go ahead.
Right. No, I'm just going to say, how many people even know that the media is the only industry mentioned in the Constitution, and explicitly protected within it? Just think about how far we've fallen since, the courts were just like, oh yeah, around the Pentagon Papers, you can't go after them. Like they have a right to expose this stuff. That is the job of the Fourth Estate, is to go after this stuff. And, I teach this in classes a lot because I talk about collapsing democracies, authoritarianism, political violence around the world. And we tend to forget just how important an independent media and, moreover, faith in an independent media is important to the existence of democracies. As soon as we lose that faith, it gets easier and easier to fall into demagoguery. This is a vital problem.
We see it demonstrated in our own country's very recent history. Think about the rise of our former president and the networks that he came from. And these aren't just media sources that are parroting not just state propaganda here, but ultimately political party propaganda in the context of the GOP. And when you turn on MSNBC, it's not frankly that different. It's different propaganda being spun for a different party's interests, but often it has the very same tenuous relationship to the facts. And the double standards here are painful to observe, but they're part of the reason why those of us who have that independence in our inclination are driven to challenge conservatism, whichever party it might emerge in. And I do see that the role of the institutional gatekeepers and the defenders of the corruption in Washington, it's one that cannot survive public critique and examination. And I think back, I just gave a presentation at a local university last week, and we were talking about President Eisenhower's departing address when he warned the American public that a military-industrial complex will destroy our rights and liberties and democracy in America unless we're knowledgeable and alert. Ultimately, we are running to help our communities and our country be knowledgeable and alert, and as an expression of that knowledge and alertness to respond to the documented abuses of the ongoing documented abuses of the past that frankly need correction in order to preserve rights and democracy in the future.
Absolutely. And it's amazing, honestly, that it's taken so long to get to something as overt as Trumpism, when Schlesinger's comments about the imperial presidency go back into the 1960s.
Right.
We've been steadily accumulating vast amounts of completely unchecked power, completely independent branches of the executive, like the CIA, which does its own thing and is not actually under the oversight of presidents even, which, people I'm sure do not know, right? We've expanded the executive so much. Yeah.
And the role of the CIA in democracy is an interesting thing for people to tug on and grapple with. It's an amazing locus of abdication, I think.
And beyond that, the fact that there are 17 intelligence agencies. We live in a literal police state, and people seem completely oblivious to that, largely because the media wants us to be oblivious to it, and both of the parties have an interest in keeping it quiet because they have both contributed to it over and over again. The only thing that's kept us from falling into outright demagoguery is the emotional commitments of the people involved. They've all exercised near dictatorial powers. They've all had an incredibly negative impact on the world. I don't know. You watch the media freaking out about W. Bush starting to introduce like drone bombing and whatnot here. And then so much silence as Obama ramps that up farther and kills more people.
Yep.
And we just completely ignore this stuff. There's a massive double standard in media coverage over it, and it makes it so difficult to actually critique these things because the media has an interest in pretending that we do have a real option when most policies do not change from administration to administration. Most things stay in place.
Yes, and I want to bring the sort of lens from the military-industrial complex and its serial abuses to public health and the pandemic, which proves this point. In no uncertain terms, Democrats and Republicans alike are committed to for-profit so-called healthcare. You cannot have for-profit and care in the same sentence.
Right.
And this is a lurking issue in our economy that I think is going widely unaddressed. We know, for instance, that the United States has performed the worst among any country in the world in terms of its pandemic response. We've lost almost 1 million Americans to the disease that has swept the whole globe and impacted no other country nearly as severely. Now, it's interesting to contrast that observation with the equally inescapable data point that there is only one industrialized country on this planet that denies the human right to healthcare, and it happens to be the very same country that has suffered 1 million deaths from COVID. Now, just to make that even worse than we might think, uniquely in the world, while people are suffering from COVID and surviving it around the world, only Americans who survive COVID are being saddled with the medical debt attendant to their diagnoses and treatments. The average the average hospital stay is over $100,000. The average diagnosis is over 15. So if you're talking about 1 million people having died and dozens of millions of Americans being infected with the disease, and yes, tests are free, and yes, vaccines are free, but treatment is not. And the amount of medical debt that is sweeping the country right now is staggering. And I frankly haven't seen updated research on this. The last I saw was that as of late last year, the aggregate amount of medical debt attendant to the pandemic was stretching towards $20 billion. That, incidentally, is the amount of money that Congress just conjured out of nowhere to give to the Defense Department that Biden didn't even ask for. And the idea that in the middle of a pandemic, instead of responding to this, frankly, macroeconomic crisis, right? It's being internalized for most people in the body politic as, oh, there's not enough workers. Oh, there's inflation. There's all this dynamic about corporate price gouging and greed, ultimately, accumulating those profits and passing them on to shareholders or executives while then passing costs on to consumers. But all of those kinds of shocks pale by comparison relative to the staggering debt that people who are lucky enough to survive this disease are grappling. And that is a uniquely American phenomenon. It's driven by very much that exact same bipartisan consensus that healthcare should be a thing in this country that you should pay for, even though across the rest of the world, it is acknowledged as a condition simply of human dignity that as a human being in an industrialized society, if you get sick, you should get the care that you need. And we could make those decisions here. One reason we haven't made those decisions here in the United States has a name, and it starts with Nancy and it ends with Pelosi. Right.
Yeah. This whole bit about, you touched on some different issues here that I think are fascinating. The rising costs. Okay, very simple one, right? I mean, under Nixon, we allow for-profit in healthcare, and what happens? Costs skyrocket across the board, massive, massive increases. And we've already had a really high level of medical bankruptcies in this country. And you mentioned a uniquely American problem. We're the only country that has medical bankruptcies. Hello. I mean,
which are the leading cause of homelessness.
Right. It's a huge issue across this country, and it drags even people who don't declare bankruptcy. You're paying so much out in debt servicing. It's similar like the student loan issue there, that you have no way of actually climbing out. I mean, we've been falling steadily in terms of, actual social mobility in this country. This is not the land of opportunity that they sold us and all that Horatio Alger bullshit. People born into poverty in the U.S. are far more likely to stay in poverty than anywhere else in the rich world. And we completely forget that.
And there's a corollary to that, which is not just that people born into poverty have a hard time escaping it, but people being born into privilege have a hard time losing it. I'm particularly struck by the Speaker of the House, who I'm challenging for her seat in Congress. Several different news outlets have reported that if she is allowed to retire on her own terms, if she is to win the 22 election, her likely next step will be to retire in order to hold a special election favoring her daughter, Christine, who has never worked in politics beyond being on the DNC, and her qualification for that is being Nancy's daughter. And the idea that a dynastic oligarch could pass on a congressional seat to her daughter as if it was just one part of her $200 million inheritance. When we live in a democracy, or at least a country that still claims the word, like the assault and the corruption, the corruption and the assault on democracy there is even more overt and more flagrant than the co-optation of Congress through corporate influence, through insider trading. What we're talking about here are wealthy families basically approaching the political system as aristocracy. And as an immigrant and as a constitutional lawyer, I am committed on both of those accounts to challenging that corruption. Democracy requires defending from threats, including oligarchy within the United States. And no one in Congress personifies and embodies it more clearly than does the voice of the most progressive city in the country.
Absolutely. I mean, the fact that the United States has been an oligarchy for so long, and yet we pretend that the problem really is Russia.
Right.
Yeah, I just posted the other day that, the top 3 U.S. billionaires have more than the top 100 Russian oligarchs. But of course, we have good billionaires. Right. I mean, this is a serious problem. And those billionaires and millionaires are buying people in Congress, which is how they make so much money on a congressional salary. You don't come in oftentimes as filthy rich as they leave. And then you have that revolving door into working as a lobbyist, so you peddle your influence to other Congress critters. It's a massive corporate corruption scandal.
It absolutely is, and it's one of the dimensions of the long overdue debate about congressional insider trading that's getting unaddressed. And I'm so grateful that you brought lobbying and the post-legislative career track onto the table. There's an ongoing discussion in Capitol Hill now about what a reform might look like that would prohibit members of Congress and their families from participating in insider trading. But even in that long overdue debate, somehow completely unaddressed are these other dimensions of precisely analogous corruption, like the corporate influence that dictates policymaking in the post-election process through this revolving door that you described. So if we're going to shut down insider trading as one impetus or one vector of corruption, why would we allow this post-legislative career track to reintroduce the very same agents of corruption through a different door?
Right.
And ultimately, if we're going to shut down corruption, we can't rest at insider trading. We need to make sure that conflicts of interest are not skewing congressional decision-making. Let me give another example of it in another way that'll hit really close to home for a lot of people. 2020, 2 years ago, when the pandemic first emerged, Ilhan Omar, a Democrat from Minnesota, proposed a bill, the Rent and Mortgage Cancellation Act. Now, this bill was profound, especially for socialists, because it represented a dramatic refashioning of the relationship between housing and people. What the Rents and Mortgage Cancellation Act would have done is suspend the payments of all rents and mortgage agreements for the entire duration of the pandemic. It would create, to enable small landlords to survive that kind of regime, a government support program to pay small landlords the rents that their low-income tenants perhaps could not. And it would ultimately force banks to pay the cost of housing, which makes a lot of sense because we've bailed out banks over and over again, and we've never bailed out homeowners. We've never bailed out renters. So why wouldn't we force the entity that we keep bailing out to bear the social costs of this unforeseen pandemic?
To bail us out for a change, yeah.
Right? And so what was the fate of the Rent and Mortgage Cancellation Act of 2020? It never got a hearing. It never got a vote. Who's the Speaker of the House? A wealthy landlady. Nancy Pelosi makes over $1 million a year in rental income. Would Democrats in Congress prove more receptive to reforms proposed to protect renters and mortgage holders if they weren't led by a wealthy landlady herself?
Right.
And, this is another dimension of a conflict of interest. It's not stock holdings. This is just property that creates a conflict of interest. And nowhere in the congressional debate over insider trading is this further vector of corruption ever addressed. So, we're starting to have a conversation that has been a long time coming, but that conversation is just the beginning. And, the train hasn't even left the station, let alone arrive at where we ultimately want it to get. But my goal ultimately is to stop corruption in Washington. There's so many vectors from which it emerges. We have to be, it might feel like whack-a-mole, but ultimately we have to shut them all down.
Right.
If we are to regain any democratic control of our government.
Yeah, no, this is a long struggle, but ultimately we need to find a way to ban cash lobbying, period. I mean, we talk in history classes about how you used to be able to walk onto the floor of the House in the 19th century and hand people envelopes full of cash. Exactly the same thing is done today. They just call it lobbying instead of bribery. And it's a bipartisan issue. We just do this all across the board, which just drives me nuts. And I love that you mentioned the conflict of interest part. I had any number of problems with him in terms of policy, but, Carter was the last one to really take that sort of thing seriously. He sold his freaking peanut farm so that he wouldn't have any kind of business conflict of interest. How many people are going into office now keeping total control over their businesses, their stock portfolios, all of their other income sources, and then legislating on those?
And this is bipartisan.
Exactly. Yes.
It wasn't just Trump appointing, Louis DeJoy to head the Postal Service. Lloyd Austin, Biden's Secretary of Defense, is a chairperson on the board of a weapons manufacturer. And like, how more obvious must the corruption get for anyone to acknowledge it?
You want to talk about people being stuck in debt. We talked about student loans early on here. Biden is the one who pushed through a bankruptcy reform that made it impossible to discharge that debt. So some of us who are drowning in it from, because poor people aren't supposed to go for PhDs, go figure. It'd be nice to find some way.
I know how you feel
Yeah. It's terrible the way that we used to sell the idea of education. And Democrats do this a lot. They sell the idea of education. Everyone should go to college because that's the jobs of the future, blah, blah, blah. And then they do everything to make the costs higher and make it harder to pay. And instead of just putting up the cash for it, like so many other rich countries do, we instead put the cash in a nice little kitty so we can make a profit off of students. So you're dragging them down, keeping them from climbing up into that middle class life, and you're making money off of it. I mean, the whole thing is deeply corrupt.
Healthcare and higher education, both are these sorts of rackets where it's a pretext to drain every cent out of the pocket of anybody who approaches it. If you're going to graduate school, you're going to pay every dime you've ever saved for your tuition. If you're lucky, and if you get sick, 40% of cancer patients exist their life savings within the first year, right? And these ideas that basic needs, healthcare is a basic need, education is a basic right. Why are we paying so much? And it's not just that the costs are going through the roof; the quality is also dropping through the floor. Right? We pay more money than any country in the world for our healthcare, and our healthcare outcomes are demonstrably the worst.
Right.
Either one of those things were bad enough. The two together is just a stunning reflection of a failure that too many Americans ignore.
And you hear from people like Pelosi, well, we can't afford things like Medicare for all, but we're already paying more than it would cost to pass the improved Medicare for all, which is far better than the currently existing one. It would still be cheaper than what we're paying now. But the difference is it wouldn't be going to corporations who are writing her checks. That's the only loss. We gain, she loses.
That's right. And it's a loss for an industrial complex that because members of Congress are committed to Wall Street first, because they're in their stock portfolios, they perceive it as a loss because it might be a loss for her stock portfolio, even though it would be a massive win for her constituents and we the people of the United States. And this is a perfect example of how that divided loyalty creates a conflict of interest and a corruption in the legislative process that somehow it took until 2022 for anyone to notice. I mean, one of the things for me in this whole debate about congressional insider trading that's so infuriating is how it was never okay to begin with. And it's been going on, not for years, for decades.
Right.
Could we even, is there any way possible to list all of the different policies that have been skewed by this conflict of interest? Of course not. Everything that Congress has done for the last generation has been inflected with this corruption, from ignoring the climate crisis to this continued commitment to for-profit healthcare, every war for profit. I could go on. All of these decisions are being structurally reinforced through this allowance of open corruption. And I don't want to pretend as if ending congressional insider trading is going to fix all the other problems overnight. It's not. But it's at least going to remove one crucial roadblock to the Green New Deal and to Medicare for all and to dismantling the Pentagon, or at least shifting some of those resources to places that they might be more helpful than instruments of death and destruction.
Right. And when you make it harder and harder to actually push through any kind of reasonable change that helps ordinary people, all you do is you push them more and more out of the political process entirely. People keep leaving the major parties, stop voting, drifting farther and farther away from this, just checking out on most elections, which of course massively favors the Republicans. And it's hard to think that Pelosi doesn't know that. She clearly doesn't care, but it also primes us for the rise of a much more overt authoritarianism. We are on the cusp of tipping into a managed democracy, a state that is so deeply corrupt. I mean, we're not even classed as a full democracy anymore. A state that is so deeply corrupt in the pockets of oligarchs that we have no real pretense of actual voting rights for us, actual liberty, actual democracy. We're losing it. We've been falling decade after decade, and it does not matter who is in the White House, Republican or Democrat. We continue to fall in Freedom House's rankings of freedom because apparently also not caring about our processes is a bipartisan concern. I love that they made such a big stink out of impeaching Trump, but over what? Like not giving money for weapons, not all the other bullshit. They didn't go after him from emoluments or anything else because, that would highlight the corruption that,
Can we talk about that really quick just for a minute? Because I think
Sure.
what we're touching on there with emoluments and Trump and impeachment is really critical for people to understand. Mm-hmm. So first of all, I spent the last 3 years trying to get Nancy Pelosi to show up for work. And when Donald Trump was the president, all she did was repeatedly support his policies while performatively, theatrically opposing his politics, ripping a speech, pointing at him sternly, putting on her shades while expanding his trade authority, his surveillance powers, his military budgets, creating camps, right? All that.
Exactly.
Now, in the context of impeachment, not just under Trump, going back to Bush, Nancy Pelosi has been a decided and an opponent to executive accountability. She learned the lesson in the 90s that impeachment is a political loser. And she just decided, watching the failed impeachment of President Clinton, that she, as a member of Congress, did not want to pursue impeachment, period. So that even when you had a right-wing president starting wars for profit and torturing some folks, she refused to show up for work. When you have a later right-wing president who's assaulting immigrant rights at the border, assaulting the rights of domestic First Amendment rights of protesters, a president who's doing all the things that Trump did, from inciting violence to filling his pockets. Pelosi opposed impeachment. She had to get dragged kicking and screaming to each of the impeachment struggles, which she then showed up for like a boxer throwing a fight. Both of the impeachment processes, Pelosi kneecapped. She first delayed them, she slow walked them, and then she limited them. She affirmatively limited them. She took off the table the most critical charges that would have brought Trump down, and that was the violation of the constitutional prohibition on self-enrichment at public's expense. And the problem, as you noted, is that the violations of that prohibition are not partisan. Trump's violations of them had a lot of democratic parallels. We just talked about some in the context of that insider trading, for instance, right? Those are emoluments violations. The only way for the emolument clause to be enforced as it relates to individual legislators is through the electoral process. And so ultimately our challenge to Pelosi is as constitutional as it is political, because I recognize that she, in her role as a legislator representing my city in Washington, has not in any way put our city's interests anywhere near the center of her legislative agenda. And again, this is that corruption that we're talking about as a through thread uniting all these different dimensions of institutional failure that we're describing. And
absolutely.
I'll leave it at that.
No, I love that you brought in the longer history with W and impeachment, because the fact that she publicly and holy shit admitted that they knew the government was lying about weapons of mass destruction, but she still voted for the war and she imposed impeachment for the lies. I mean, the fact that everyone stood to make money off of this, the fact that she stood to make money off of this from all the corporate lobbying on this, I mean, it ties all of them together. How many Democrats again and again have voted for wars and for U.S. imperialism and then, try to complain when the other side's in there? It's just partisan theater. It was sort of genius in a sense almost to have taken the parties from actually having substantive policy disagreements and instead shifting them to social issues so that they both can agree on the financial issues and ultimately fleece us. All they fight over is
describing that legacy of Clinton again.
Yeah, exactly. All they fight over is it's just a bunch of political theater fighting over like social stuff. Should we be nice to people or should we be a dick to people? Meanwhile, you keep sucking money out of our wallets and killing millions of people around the world. So, I mean, what do we really gain there? The fact that there are so few substantive policy differences between the two parties, I think is something most Americans have no idea, because what they see is what the media talks about. They do have significant differences in basic social and cultural values. So it's a matter of belief, what you feel, it matters more in terms of human dignity or whatever. That's ultimately it. Actual policy stuff on economics, on war, there's almost no disagreement.
This is the reduction of politics to opportunities for virtue signaling, ultimately. And,
right.
And if we think about the role of, for instance, the co-optation of the Democratic Party in the 90s and its seizure by Wall Street in taking off the table so many progressive aspirations, from a federal jobs guarantee, which is finally again being discussed about in the context of the Green New Deal, to universal health care, which disappeared from the public conversation for decades after that, right? The co-optation of the nominally Labor Party by capital is, as a child of British imperialism, entirely familiar. Divide and conquer has been the tool of colonists and empires for generations.
Absolutely.
And whether it's dividing and conquering Americans by constructing these divisions over social issues while then remaining this institutional consensus favoring capital, or, you know, another way that this has played out in our nation's history, unfortunately, is with respect to race, where capital constructed race and racism as a way to divide Americans who shared working class interests.
Absolutely.
And this serial process that has proven, unfortunately, spectacularly successful in co-opting many observers, in pulling the wool over the eyes of others, and in ultimately marginalizing voices that would do something about it. You know, from Brother Malcolm to Dr. King to Fred Hampton, you know, there's a pattern in this country of shooting the messengers while guarding the establishments. And this is, to your point, guarding the establishment from both sides. And the idea that Democrats and Republicans alike are defending Wall Street first, especially at a time like this when the crises are so profound and they are compounding one another, from the pandemic to the climate crisis to the crisis in state violence, from abroad to our own city streets. At a time like this, for our institutions to not have we the people of the United States at heart, for the institutions to be formally committed to capital instead of people in our communities, it's devastating. And it's already run 1 million Americans into early graves during this pandemic. I should make this point clear too. We talked about Medicare for All, and I've come back to the pandemic a couple different points. I just want to remind people, Public Citizen, the nonprofit group, has established that 1/3 of the people who died from COVID in the United States would still be alive if we had universal health care. We're talking about 300,000 Americans dead to fill the pockets of investors and executives of pharmaceutical and health insurance companies. That's not okay by a long shot. There's no perspective or theory from which it could be okay. Even capitalists would acknowledge that as problematic. And yet still, that is the committed policy of a country that claims to be free.
Right. It's insane. You know, there's a couple of points I think I can sum up a few things we hit here, and then I want to round to another point and kind of touch back on something that you braced earlier that I wanted to ask you about. But this the questions you brought up about, like, you know, race and divide and rule. I mean, I often joke with my students that, like, the historian's curse is to, like, see us make the same stupid mistakes over and over and over again. It's astonishing the degree to which things have not changed. The same kind of racist politics that you had in the 1890s to break the original, like, populist, progressive, and People's Party movements, you know, are what people use today. Culture wars are in the main a form of divide and rule. If you get us fighting over where we come from, or the social values or whatever, and this is true of right and left, they both play cultural politics. They both do it for the same basic reason too. And this is not to say there are not actual legitimate differences and that some people are not horrifying. I get that. But when you emphasize that and you use it to downplay the actual substantive concerns that affect people's pocketbooks, that affect our lives, that kill so many people, all you're doing is engaging in a kind of political theater that's ultimately self-serving. It just drives me crazy to see this stuff repeated over and over again, decade after decade.
From the right to the left.
Right, and the left.
I encountered this myself among groups that claim to be on the left, that undermine socialism, their own stated principles, and more or less every value they could claim to care about, while embracing a racist character assassination orchestrated by the Democratic Party to defend its corrupt leader. And this infected groups that claim to be on the left, right? And this idea that people are so easily hoodwinked and weaponized against themselves in the service of virtue signaling. You know, we talked before about the reduction of politics to simply signaling virtue, as distinct from building support for and movements to enable and force policies that change the material outcomes and lived conditions of our communities. Politics can be It should be, it's supposed to be a collective exercise in self-liberation. And instead, it has become an industry. And, we're one of the reasons I'm running for Congress is to help restore a constitutional ethic and at least replace one person in one seat who is very much a projection of business as method and in substance of her policymaking, with a voice that stood, again, for human rights instead of
right. And politics should be driven by actual virtue, not virtue signaling, which means we should be caring about the actual policy outcomes of what we're talking about, not just dancing around. So you mentioned Occupy a little bit ago, and I remember being involved in the Occupy movement and things like the Battle for Seattle in '99 and, the whole anti-globalization movement and whatnot. So I wanted to ask you about your time in like advocacy, activism, any work that you've done there in addition to the campaign, because, we both agree here that running for office is not just about us. It's about the communities as a whole. It's about lifting people up and empowering them. And I know that you've lived that. So want to share a few things?
Sure. Thank you for that prompt. I ran for Congress only after 15 years at the time, and it's been 20 now, of policy advocacy, direct action, community organizing, and art in action. You mentioned the Battle of Seattle, which was the first point in my consciousness where I came to understand that there was a street movement beyond academia challenging corporate globalization. And that for me was a wake-up call. I came out west to go to law school, and I was grateful to be on the West Coast during the era of the peace movement responding to Bush's invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. And that era for me, organizing mass direct actions everywhere from the financial district of San Francisco, which we shut down for 36 hours, 20,000 people from around the Bay Area, to the action that I really cut my teeth on and sort of the organizing project that really dragged me into the rabbit hole of grassroots organizing against imperialism was a shutdown of a Lockheed Martin facility in Santa Clara, California in 2003. And that's not a left-wing part of the state. That's a pretty conservative part of California. And the idea of shutting down a weapons manufacturer's facility for a day as a group of students was incredibly empowering. And it really helped me understand what popular sovereignty meant. It's presented to us in law school as a constitutional principle, but I came to understand what it means as an organizing tool in that era. I went to Washington after that. I had a chance in the courts to defend campaign finance reform successfully in the federal courts before the Citizens United decision flipped that phase of my career on its head. I also had a chance to fight in the courts very early on in the struggle for marriage equality for same-sex couples. And this was at a time when Democrats, including Nancy Pelosi, refused to acknowledge the rights of my neighbors. Right. And there are a few ironies to me that are more profound. That Nancy Pelosi, the person who had all the privilege and power of the Speaker of the House in the 2000s, who refused to support gay rights at that time, who showed up for marriage equality on the eve of the Obergefell decision by a relatively conservative Supreme Court that eventually enshrined marriage equality as a right across the United States. She did not show up for that struggle. Right. I was fighting in court for the rights of my neighbors a decade before Pelosi, with all of her privilege and power and wealth, could even be bothered to acknowledge those rights. And yet still, it is the gay community in San Francisco that is ultimately her principal political bulwark. To some extent, because the gay community in San Francisco doesn't understand how much she has done to undermine its interests over time. And also because the gay community in San Francisco has been actively weaponized as a disinformation network. And between the co-optation of constituents by career and dynasty politicians and their weaponization against their own interests, it's further dimensions of the corruption that we described before. When we talked about insider trading, what we're talking about is sort of like endogenous dimensions of corruption within a legislature. What we're talking about here are the ways that corruption among institutional politicians begets further corruption in the nominal grassroots. And to see supposedly grassroots groups undermining their own stated principles to serve the careers of powerful party officials it's frankly revolting. No more so than any of these other patterns we're describing, but it does ultimately stiffen my resolve and leave me all the more eager, frankly, to offer my community and my city an alternative.
Absolutely. I mean, how many people actually today remember that it was, the Defense of Marriage Act, passed under Democrats and with the support of Democrats and passed under a Democratic president. And
this was a bill, mind you, that left LGBT marriage equality to the states. It was a states' rights bill, which is a quintessential conservative approach to approaching these contested social issues.
Yeah, I think that it's the issue about like the support and the gay community in San Francisco. To me, it's part of like a much broader network. I mean, look at the impact of like rainbow capitalism. I mean, a kind of like, performative bits of representation, and people are so happy to find bits of representation in media, and the occasional shout out that they don't look below the surface very much, and that's honestly true of every constituency in the U.S. We're all manipulated to varying degrees because most of us simply don't have time. We're worked endless hours. We don't have time when we get home to scratch the surface and look for what's under there. We used to depend upon an independent media to report and to share those things and to actually raise consciousness about these things. And it has not done that for a long, long time, if arguably it ever did so. This is one of the reasons that I've been such I've been a lifetime proponent of street power and street politics and direct action. Yeah. So it's why it's very refreshing to hear someone talk about this, because I think that anybody who gets in, and so, if or when you beat Pelosi and you replace her in that seat, you will still depend upon street power and street actions. We all will, because it's the only thing that keeps Congress really accountable. It's the only thing that can keep that momentum going, is to mobilize people in the streets. And one of the things we've often done is choose one or the other. We either show up for big protests and we push there, and then there's no electoral component to it, or we show up for elections and we do not hold them accountable. So
this is about those connections between the above the waterline and below the waterline.
Exactly. Yeah, we need to pay attention to both. We need political power and street power, and they need to work together, or we're never actually going to have a people's party again. We're never actually going to have real representation for us. So
I want to push back, if I can, just a little bit.
Good. Yeah.
And this is constructive. I think of the role between street power and grassroots power and institutional power, sort of like the way that the founders constructed the division of power among the separation of the branches of government. So the judiciary and the executive and the legislative branches are supposed to fight one another. And similarly, I think of street heat and grassroots groups should be committed to fighting institutions. Now, to your point, I think it'd be great if we had some standard bearers in the institutions who were willing to fight on the inside for the principles that motivate so many of us on the outside. And I think, to be fair, on some issues, there are those standard bearers. But when we talk at this level of the critique against corporate corruption, we frankly don't have voices in Congress that are acting to structurally destabilize that corporate rule. And that's part of what I'm aiming to do. And I think in that context that there's, the race that we're running offers to voices on the left something like a force multiplier, if only because the voice that I'm poised to remove from Congress is such a powerful anti-change institutional inertia force. And if my only contribution to the body politic was removing Pelosi from Congress, that in itself, I think, would be a massive contribution to the future. Again, even short of that, just holding her accountable, I think, creates opportunities for policy. At the end of the day, I see the voices of truth, peace, justice in Washington being more or less entirely in exile. And for many of us whose political origins started in direct action, it's not just a tool in the box that I will use when I get there. I mean, I am a child of that community, from the anti-globalization movement through the peace movement into the immigrant rights era, through democracy, the Occupy era when we were defending democracy, into the movement for Black lives stemming not from the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, but years before that, from Mike Brown and Freddie Gray, and to have been part of the movement across that entire spectrum, that continuum of 20 years, and to have found myself challenging the administrations of both Democrats and Republicans and members of Congress from both sides of the partisan aisle, it is painfully clear to me how much is at stake and how clearly we have to draw the lines. And there's a lot of prevarication in Congress right now among progressives who recognize that there are structural problems but might feel politically constrained from being as aggressive as they might want to be in calling them out. And ultimately the constraints impeding their ability to be more outspoken, to use direct action themselves, to champion thoughtfully the needs and the policies that we need for the future. Among the people that constrain those progressives are Nancy Pelosi. And I want to, if I can, let's just name a couple names here. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez made a name for herself when she first came to Congress by holding a sit-in at Nancy Pelosi's office. And through that, she helped pioneer and bring to the public discussion this vision of the Green New Deal that right now is not embodied in legislation because Nancy Pelosi denied AOC the key congressional seat that she would have needed to develop the Green New Deal into policy. Beyond the Green New Deal, if we're serious about climate justice, we have to do two further things. We have to dismantle the Pentagon, or at least stop the CIA from toppling the next democracy at the drop of a hat to steal its oil. And we have to also nationalize the fossil fuel sector. There is not a single voice in Congress talking about either of those needs at the moment. And if we pretend that climate justice is just a matter of energy policy, we might as well just shove the future off a cliff now, because no amount of energy policy alone is going to fix this. This is ultimately, there's a reason Dr. King described capitalism and racism and militarism as intersecting. Nothing describes that intersection more clearly than the climate crisis. And again, I see in Congress this deficiency in the present debate precisely because of the co-optation of the body by so many of these powerful institutional gatekeepers. And while I am grateful for the progressive voices that are out there, like a torch in the darkness, they ultimately need some help. And
they do.
Excited to offer.
Yeah, and I think nothing shows the ways in which the duopoly do not serve our interests than like the climate crisis or the questions of the military. Democrats are always lining up to throw more money at the Pentagon. And when people, I mean, the most severe critics you've got out there are people like, I don't know, but wasn't it Kucinich in 2004 who said he wanted to cut 10% off and he was just laughed off the stage? That's already, no one wants even consider that. 10% off of it when it's already about $1 trillion a year? I mean, come on, we can do a lot better than that.
We're fighting and they just won't. Over a bill to just shift 5% of the Pentagon's funding.
Right. And we just
homelessness with 5% of the Pentagon.
Right. And we won't do it.
Eliminate medical debt. You could waive all the student debt. There's so much you could do.
Right. No, we don't disagree there on at all in terms of the way that these two things need to work together, because the one is intended to hold the other accountable. You know, the street power is intended to push the people in Congress. You know, one of the
or push them out if they refuse to be pushed.
Right. Yeah. And honestly, one of the fun kind of like, you know, unspoken truths that were sort of like floating around there that I was honestly amazed didn't get brought up more when I was actually in politics was that my origins politically, my background is in the anarchist. You know, I'm on the libertarian left. I inherently distrust hierarchy and authority. Anybody who gets in there has to be held accountable, and they will always fall into the different traps. They will make compromises. We do have a number of brilliant voices out there, like your AOCs and your Bernie Sanderses out there, but they also make terrible decisions too. And Bernie has plenty of times caved to the military-industrial complex. We need to hold even the best voices accountable, and that's where the street is useful, and that's how we can keep pushing things along. If we separate these two completely, if we don't have that power in the streets, then we're never actually going to have anything in Washington that can speak for us.
I agree, and the only addition I'd offer there is that challenges like ours to entrenched incumbents are a projection, basically, of that street heat into the electoral sphere. And
Absolutely.
You know, we're talking about policy and politics as this continuum of processes that need for movements to project themselves into the electoral arena, not just by critiquing incumbents, but specifically by building alternatives, new voices to replace them.
Good. Yes.
A critical part that goes, I think, widely overlooked, unfortunately.
Yeah. Cultivating new generations, getting more people involved, continually push people in there so that we don't end up with these long-term incumbents that are only serving those entrenched interests of the swamp. So I think that's a great way to kind of like bring us back around here. I want to wind this down with one really big question here that I think we all know the answer to based on your policies and your history in the runs here. So as an independent Democrat, would you pledge to hold people accountable in Congress of either party for their decisions and their actions?
Yes, absolutely. Any party. I mean, I ultimately hope to diversify the party representation in Congress, and I'm eager to hold accountable corruption wherever it emerges, whatever the party, whatever the person, whatever the political interest. It is absolutely critical that we guard our democracy against structural corruption. And it has unfortunately set in like a rot at many different points in the system. And I am much more committed to principles than I am to any political party.
Exactly. This is the thing. I mean, supporting for the political process, supporting the parties, working within the parties, is important because it's the system that we have, but we need to be guided by principles. We need to focus on policies, and we need actually to restore ethics to government. And sadly, it is the one thing that no one seems to be really talking about, that 90% of voters would agree with. Across the board, people understand just how corrupt this system is, but we don't actually get opportunities to change unless we have these kind of insurgent campaigns. So I want to just give you an opportunity here to then plug websites, social media, anything like that, because, and a point that I try to make constantly throughout my run, and I talk about with everybody else's that I'll support there, for the price of like a coffee a month, you can help put you can help put people, we can run races all across this country. It really adds up. People keep thinking, well, I don't have $500 or $5,000 to spend, so they don't need my money. No, they do. $5 a month makes a huge difference if you set up those recurring donations. And these progressive challengers all across the country, they need your help. They need your help to get their message out so we can actually break these entrenched power dynamics. So if you want to plug any of your media.
Thank you, Liam. Yeah, folks are welcome to learn more about our campaign. Sign up to donate or to volunteer with us at shahidforchange.us. We have a short link that redirects there, shahid.fyi. We're active on all of the major social media platforms, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, at Shahid for Change. And anybody who shares an interest in any of these issues, wherever in the country you might be, you can make a difference in our campaign to end the Pelosi dynasty and guard the future from the failures of the past. And we welcome your support. And if you have any questions, by all means, feel free to reach out to us, info@shahidforchange.us.
Well, this has been a lot of fun. So thanks very much for coming on and chatting with us here. I've been a band for a long time, and hopefully the people watching this are going to get interested and jump on there and support you, because we do need we need your voice in Washington. We need change there. So
thank you, brother. It's great to be with you. I appreciate our conversations. You have a distinctly professorial analysis, and I'm grateful for the chance to share some time with you.
Yeah, well, I am what I am. All right. Thanks very much for your time. Yeah, and we'll catch you all later.